I'm very pleased to be here today to share this panel. When I first received the invitation to be part of this panel, I immediately accepted it because it's a great opportunity to meet with friends and colleagues. But when I started preparing for this presentation, I really found it very challenging and daunting because firstly, there are lots of issues to problematize when we think about an economic transition and particularly about the politics of the economic transition, because the literature on this subject is not very well developed. So what I'm going to do today is to really leave a few pointers for us to discuss when it comes to transition and really to frame the discussion. But before I do that, let me begin by putting two things on the table. I think as a political economist, I would like to problematize both the idea of transition as well as the divide between the short run and the long run. Now, of course, when we think about transition, there is variation in the region because there are countries that have made just a de jure transition, and Tunisia is a key example. There are other countries that have made a transition from a weak social and economic order to a very fragile, unstable order, such as Libya. And there are others, such as Egypt, who have what statisticians would call really are part of the process of mean reversion, where the old order is recalibrating itself. Similarly, I think when we think about the short term and the long term, some of this divide is really political in itself, because what is really urgent for the ruler, for political survival, is often relegated to the short term. Whereas the long term are all those demands that can be pushed into the future. And sometimes these are really fundamental reforms. So my sense for preparing this discussion really was to think about a long-term anchor while we are thinking about this transition in the short term. So okay, without further ado, let me offer a few notes and reflections. Let me begin by kind of restating very quickly, but adding a few things to whatever you've heard so far. There's a great deal of consensus now amongst many of the people in this room and who have certainly contributed a great deal to this literature, is that the Arab development model, if there was ever such a thing, has actually failed. It's very difficult, becoming more and more difficult to sustain it. And as Tariq Yusuf described that model as a model that consists of intervention in the economy and extensive welfare commitments, these are indeed extremely difficult to sustain. But also because this development model has, in recent years, generated a series of factors that I would call them as part of the latent conflict. So some of the work that Ishaq and others have done look at the politics of fiscal adjustment when the state had to retract, which created new grievances amongst the middle classes, the rise of crony capitalist structures, again, some excellent work done by Ishaq and other well-known colleagues, the persistence of a large shadow economy, which not many people talked here about, but it's extremely important, as Raghi says, for labor market outcomes, particularly in Egypt. And of course, the insider-outsider dynamics that it has generated. I mean, you have a situation where, as a firm, you survive either when you're very close to the state or you're very far from the state. And the cronyism that it generates actually means that much of the privilege is concentrated amongst the large firms, and much of the employment is concentrated with the small firms. So I think few of us would disagree that the region needs a new social contract, a new relationship, dynamic relationship between the state and society. And it should be a social contract where the private sector plays a very important role. But the key question is, how do we get to that social contract? And it's a very difficult question in political economy. How do countries shift their social contracts? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that actually it's extremely difficult to change a social contract unless you have a constrained political domain. With unconstrained politics, it's extremely difficult to revise the social contract. Now, before I begin my thoughts on this subject, let me place a key hypothesis here, which is that when I look back at the Arab Spring and the revolutions that it was associated with, I find that actually the period of falling oil prices, the current period, has had a more revolutionary impact so far in terms of the reforms that are being broached in the Arab world. I mean, think about, there's first time in GCC where subsidy reforms are being talked about in a very serious way. Public sector consolidation is a key item. You know, there are issues to do with, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, the housing reform. You know, the housing is a big issue in GCC economies. And so the imposition of the tax on idle land, and much of this idle land exists on the peripheries of the urban areas, and much of that land is actually owned by elites, by connected elites, by members of the dominant coalition. The idea that Saudi Arabia could actually tax its own elites is a real concession. And many of those concessions actually you do not find in Arab Spring countries where there has been a de jure change, but in terms of the underlying rules of the game, the underlying institutional milieu, there's hardly any concession that has been given. And of course, violence has played an important part in this, because violence has introduced a moment of suspension where regimes can go back to the old ways of doing things and defer the urgent reforms to the future. So when I think about political economy of transition, I thought, let me present 7 key dimensions which we need to consider to really frame this discussion. The first dimension has to do with time. It's not sufficiently appreciated in our literature, but I think time is extremely important, how long it takes to introduce reform. The second thing that I would like to talk about is the role of incentives, particularly the incentives of the rulers to instill reform. The third issue is one of rents, which comes up again and again, both natural resource rents, but more importantly, rents that are generated from domestic manipulation of the economy that are often associated with crony capitalism, for instance. Another aspect for political economy of reform is uncertainty. Again, hugely important factor in countries like Egypt and Tunisia. This brings me to the process of reform, whether or not policymakers can think about appropriate sequencing and what it entails when you're reforming. Finally, politics of coalitions, and I will end by actually talking about non-linearities in the reform process, but also in terms of development outcomes. Now, when I think about most of these issues, obviously I'm focusing more on instigating reform, because in political economy one can really distinguish between when rulers instigate reform and when do they actually sustain, how they are able to sustain it. And clearly the Arab world is very much in the first stage at the moment. When we think about time, the key insight we have so far is that actually there is no well-developed theory of institutional change. In fact, much of the literature on new institutional economics tells us that institutions matter for development. What they don't tell us very much, or at least very convincingly, is a theory of institutional changes, hugely underdeveloped area. So we really need to begin with an humble admission that we actually know very little about how countries make institutional transformations. Now, of course, when Douglas North started out thinking on these issues, he was really challenging to what he thought were erroneous assumptions of neoclassical theory. Firstly, that institutions do not matter, and secondly, time does not matter. And whilst North talked about these issues in detail, he really focused on the first part, which is about institutions. Therefore, we don't have a very good understanding of actually what is the second element relating to time. Well, one thing that we could say with a great degree of confidence, that it actually takes a very long time to create institutions that impact development. Many of the institutions we want to see, private sector development, good governance, and so on and so forth. In fact, most of the factors that Hafiz and Mohsin highlighted are reforms that we would be talking about in 20 years' time in this room in much the same way, unless we talk about the politics of those reforms, because many of those reforms are not politically neutral. They would create winners and losers, but it takes a long time. Now, England, of course, took about 200 years to make a transition from a minimally effective state to a developed polity. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that we need 200 years today, but we need to have a sense of how long it takes despite the many changes in technology, social behaviors, so on and so forth. The other thing about timing is that transition dynamics are often misunderstood. Whenever there are institutional cracks appearing on the horizon, for instance, when countries are failing, state failure is sometimes a moment for creative institutional change. And we have seen through history that a lot of societies have actually made setbacks, but they were actually in the process of creating new institutions. The second aspect, which I think is hugely important from the perspective of reform, is ruler incentives. Because ultimately it's the rulers who need to give concessions. And when do they give concessions? When there is fire under the feet of the ruler. Right? Now the Saudi regime, for instance, was considering imposing a tax on idle land for the last 10 years, but it implemented it today. And when it implements it, it effectively means the elite taxing itself. Now, that usually happens when there is no other option. As the political economists would say, Daron Acemoglu and others, it's the revolution constraint on elite preferences. You know, when there's the fear of revolution that inspires, instigates reform in many of these countries. So you need systematic vulnerability in order to instigate reform. Now, of course, a key issue is resource scarcity. And this resource scarcity is important for us to understand why the GCC today is thinking about those areas of reform that it was never able to kind of broach in the last 10 years or so. And resource scarcity also explains why in Egypt reform hasn't really taken hold of, at least till now. Now, a key issue that Robert Bates raised, but it's not sufficiently realized in the MENA context, is that incentives of those with the greatest capacity for violence matter. If you look at British history, it was really the Navy Armed Merchants Alliance that created an opening for institutional change, which means that change often begins when those who have the coercive capacity throw their weight behind the productive forces. And this is particularly relevant for the Middle Eastern countries because here, unlike many other developing countries, those who have coercive power, including the members of the intelligence and security apparatus, have a veto power over key reform issues, whether it's subsidies, whether it's employment, because it's essentially part of the regime stability. So a new discourse for the region requires us to think about ways in which those who have coercive power throw their weight behind productive forces. And of course, change, wherever it happens through an incentive-compatible process, which is compatible with the incentives of the elites, essentially. Now, this brings me to another issue, which is the role of rents. And the rents that I have in mind are unearned income streams from domestic manipulation of the economy. And when we think about rents and elite incentives, of course, rents serve a very important purpose in binding elite commitments towards regime stability. They are important instruments. They have a functional role in minimizing violence and fostering economic development. And of course, this new view about rents and political orders is very much a revision of the old view that we had from Kruger and Bhagwati, who associated rents with inefficient economic control, with a large state that intervenes in the economy. While that is true, but indeed, even when the MENA states receded from the economic sphere, reduced their imprint on the economy, they actually generated rents in the process of liberalization. So what really matters for rents is how do they actually insert into a particular political order. Now, of course, when we think about crony capitalism, we must remember, and of course, cronyism had its huge problems, obviously, in the region in terms of excluding the small businesses from the productive domain and undermining the competition in the economy. But actually, when you think about crony capitalism, there's more at play than actually the literature tells us. I mean, it's actually, crony capitalism was a key feature. It was the norm in most experiences of capitalist transformation. So if you think about Britain in the 17th century, United States in the 18th century with its robber barons, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, China, a lot of other societies where they had cronyism. How did they manage to grow despite cronyism is an important question. In fact, If you go back to North's original book, he talks about the way in which in early stages of development, all economic organizations are also political organizations. In fact, if you think about the global experience, there are very few countries where capitalists emerged independently from the state, right? So in each of these cases, you actually had capitalists emerging from within the body politic, from within the state. Now, of course, that has implications for this new, exciting discourse, which has generated a lot of interesting data, of which I'm myself a part of. I'm writing a paper for an ERF project. But one needs to think about cronyism and its effects in a larger milieu, and thinking about issues that might differentiate cronyism in this region from other parts of the world. So some of the questions that we need to ask is whether rents are enhancing the productive frontier, whether they are time-bound, linked with competition ultimately, and importantly, an aspect that I think has not been sufficiently highlighted, but which I believe is very important for the region, is the extent to which there are linkages with the economy. Because we describe these crony capitalists as capitalists who are connected to the state and the political functionaries. And of course, they're very strongly connected. But how strongly connected are they to the other productive actors of the economy? Because it is possible that while cronies grow, there is filtering down, there's trickle down, and the others also grow and ultimately compete with them at the later stage. And I think that's an important issue to bear in mind. And that leads me to ask and really pose this to the discussion here, is whether asset confiscation of politically connected firms after the Arab Spring was a sensible policy. I'm not sure about it, but I think it certainly needs to be put on the table, because in many countries where reform has taken place, it actually was a process of institutional conversion, where old institutions, old systems were converted to serve new purposes. And by confiscating assets, perhaps it might have led to greater uncertainty and greater fall in investment. Now, of course, the key question I want to pose is how, it's not that rents do not matter. Rents matter a great deal, but we need to have a nuanced understanding of the role that rents play in the study in development. If you think about China's reform experience that many people have talked about, was a dual-track reform experience where the rents for the old guards were maintained, they were preserved, while new rents were created through liberalization of the economy. So it was a gradual process where you gradually expand the coalition by generating new rents but keeping some of the old ones. Another aspect for political economy of reform is uncertainty. It's a hugely important issue. And of course, some of my co-panelists have highlighted the sharp falls in investment and output, but heightened expectations for immediate economic relief. Now, of course, there's a huge deal of uncertainty around in these economies, and that is explaining some of this growth performance that we've seen with these recent slides. And so a key issue in political economy of reform is how do you actually resolve the uncertainty that faces the ruler? Now, resolving that aggregate uncertainty requires more than economics or policy. It requires us to think seriously about the incentive frameworks. For instance, one of the key issues about uncertainty is it actually increases risk aversion towards reform, obviously. But the key issue here is that reform often appears more threatening than it actually is, and therefore it becomes more of a hindrance. And of course, there are many other crucial uncertainties for the ruler's objective function. What is the true level of support for the regime? The ruler doesn't know very much about. How much redistribution is enough to generate compliance from the masses? And very importantly, how much to repress? It's huge uncertainty around that domain. And so there are ways in which improving state capacity might allow rulers, a better informational base might allow rulers to get a grip on this. And of course, the ruler, like in any classic political economy framework, faces a real commitment problem when it comes to reform. And the commitment problem is, how do you agree for reform today that it might undercut your power tomorrow? And that is indeed why most countries that have reformed, they have sorted that commitment problem head on. by actually ensuring some kind of ruler stability. So if you're thinking about the East Asian experience or the Eastern European experience, yes, of course, there was gradualism, good momentum, open economic policies, all the good things we were talking about, but there was stability for the ruler so that he could go beyond this whole idea about uncertainty. Of course, can there be a trade-off? Can there be a new bargain that provides rulers some stability in return for reform? It's a question that some of us could ask. But of course, much of this issues of timing and uncertainty are linked with processes, that when we think about institutional reform, it's a very gradual process. And much of the literature has talked about outcomes, replicating good outcomes, without understanding the processes that lead us to those outcomes, whether it's premature democratization, private sector development, good governance. These are all great ends to achieve. How do you get there is a very difficult question. Of course, it depends on your initial conditions, what sort of historical legacies you had, what political settlements you had, the balance of power between various groups. And of course, the issue of sequencing. You could talk about all the nice reforms today on Saudi Arabia, but I think one reform that donors can push, or the international community can push immediately, are the financial sector reforms, because we know both Saudi Arabia and Oman are going to approach the international markets for debt finance. And that's when greater pressure could be applied to actually open up their financial markets, introduce capital market development, secondary capital debt markets, better regulatory framework, and so on and so forth. In other words, what you also need in this process is not just gradualism, but also thinking about this dual process of reform that Chinese implemented, which was really keeping elements of the old system in place while bringing changes on the margin. So, of course, that's one way to go about it. Others would say maybe you need a large-scale big bang reform process, which is not reversible at all. But of course, one has to look at really the political context of various countries to think about those strategies. Politics is crucial, of course, when you think about reform, but it's not the politics in the restrictive sense of electoral democracy. It's the importance of negotiations, compensations, compromises. In other words, you need the politics that creates bargaining structures. It's the politics that creates vibrant, stronger institutional linkages to various actors in society. It's a politics that would not just implement or introduce economic reform. It's a politics that would create a new discourse on economic reforms. And I feel that in the Arab world today, it is not just economic reform that we lack. It's a proper discourse on economic reforms that we are lacking. And of course, much of this requires us to think about coalition building. And again, there are different shades of evidence around this, because building greater coalitions, can either paralyze decision-making because it's too broad a coalition, but at the same time, it can buy in greater support for some of these reforms. And one idea, of course, that many of the old transition economies, particularly those with a communist and socialist background, did was to actually broaden the selectorate. You're talking about these various old communist party structures which have thousands and thousands of members. I think Egypt had a similar system. It had, at least early on in the Mubarak era, there was a large presence of party functionaries. Now, part of that social base narrowed down towards the later part of 2000s. Now, of course, that requires you to think about widening access to some of these members of the coalition. And so you need to understand what dominant coalitions are, how you can actually expand those dominant coalitions. And wherever reform has taken place, it has usually taken place in a milieu where, at the same time, coalitions have broadened. There's a greater access for them, even if not for everyone in the society. Now, my final 3 slides, I'm going to talk about the important aspect, which, of course, is important both for understanding development in most regions, but particularly in this region, and also with special reference to reform, which statisticians talk about non-linearities. The idea that Albert Hirschman and others, we really need to refresh ourselves with some of those ideas, that development often happens in a cluster, it's very difficult. There are a lot of complementarities. There is good and bad equilibrium at the same time. So you really need to think about development taking place in ways that is very difficult to identify causality. And it's often, Albert Hirschman used to say, development is a record of good linkages, various linkages, political, economic, but certainly he had productive linkages in his mind. So in other words, when you think about development, you need to think about a kind of a map for social, economic, and political connections. In philosophy, they would say it's the rhizomatic structure, which is the opposite of the tree-like structure, where you don't have a beginning or end. You actually have a series of connections. And all of that really invites us to think about development in a broader milieu and actually looking at the larger picture, because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And therefore, you need to think about development in a broader frame. If you do that, actually it's important, and it's a point that I've been highlighting for a few years, is the importance of the regional dimension of development, the regional connections. Because regional complementarities, particularly when you think about a whole range of questions, are extremely important. Think about reform. I mean, most of these reform experiences, Mohsen mentioned Eastern Europe in the 1980s, China after the Mao period, Turkey, you have Vietnam, lots of other examples that I can offer. In each of these cases, there was a regional growth bargain. Eastern Europe's political transition would have been failed if Europe had not opened its markets. So, and those were important. Why? Because they offer as a commitment device for the ruler. It ensures that reforms are not reversible. It solves that commitment problem that I was highlighting before. And what you truly lack in this part of the world is that regional growth bargain. And of course, the regional element is important for incentives in another way, which is that many of the social contracts in the region, including Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, lots of other places, they're actually financed through GCC, I won't say free, but basically with very little conditionality, these cash flows that are coming in every year. So they create a major moral hazard problem. And they're not part of a regional growth bargain that provides financing in return for certain reforms. And that, I think, that regional dimension is a hugely important aspect. My final slide is really the external dimension, which is obviously recognized on the sidelines of conferences, but it's important now when we think about the new development agenda for the Middle East, we should think about the internal and the external dimensions together. Because in Arab political economy in particular, the internal and the external are co-constituted. Because of the variety of linkages, and of course now, as everyone would recognize, much of what we are seeing in the region really is a global, peace is a global public good at the moment. It's not just a Middle Eastern aspiration. Yet, I think I find the present approach hugely problematic, the way in which Western intervention has dealt a severe blow to development in the region. Because the post-intervention political order in the Arab world is defined by new political settlements, and these settlements are largely ethnic or sectarian in nature. It's a replay of the Lebanese muhassasa system, right? It's a system of spoils, which has created divisive rather than cohesive political elites, the exactly opposite of what we want for development. It makes what Timothy Besley called common interest institutions. These common interest institutions that provide public goods, that connect communities, they are ever more difficult to provide, because with this ethnic and sectarian political settlements, they will fight all the time on their rents, but common interest institutions, very difficult to emerge. And in fact, there are very few incentives for investments in state capacity, in extractive capacity, but also legal and market capacity. All of this bodes ill for the region, because the West has used its convening authority to convene various states and create new frameworks, has been deployed more towards warfare rather than welfare. And of course, much of the literature that we find from new institutional economics talks about the violence trap, and the only way to to break the void, multiple exchange linkages that bind different actors and that increase the cost of violence. Those are absent. In fact, what we find is there is no new post-conflict agenda or post-conflict order in the Middle East. There's hardly any sense of it. And in fact, if you think about much of what the World Bank or the IMF or other institutions have to offer, they have national development strategies, small inputs, but there's no regional growth program. There is no regional development vision. And I think in this conference we should at least try and broach those issues. They're important, and I'll finish with one key issue which I think really, to me, is the most frustrating aspect, is that when historians will write about the history of the way we have dealt with the Arab Spring, I think there would be one dark spot, and that's Tunisia. Because there's one country that could have succeeded in the wake of the Arab uprising, was not given the right support. I mean, all these partnership initiatives that we heard about, Dovell Partnership and others, they basically substituted talk for action. And when it came to putting down concrete resources and using them to buy influence for reform, they were completely absent. And I think I'll end there.